Here's the situation. I am coming up on a decade of teaching social studies at a local high school. This last year, the 2024 to 2025 school year, has been the first in my experience in which a series of books has been banned. Each time after the first big wave of bans, the faculty received an email that looks something like this. Orders to remove material from school grounds. At no point should a student be able to access this material from their place of learning. Tricks by Ellen Hopkins deserved an all caps subject for some reason, and Living Dead Girl urgent highlighting. Providing a safe environment for our students, the emails all conclude, because that is what makes students feel unsafe. Books, ooh, scary. Might have tipped my hand a bit there. Yes, I do tend to be hesitant about book banning or removal, if we want to be politically correct here, but I don't consider myself too extreme or close-minded on a topic. I'm no absolutist when it comes to freedom of expression. Not all ideas need to be accessible in all places for people of all ages. However, considering the history of book burning and bans on ideas, and that particularly history classrooms should be places of exposure to ideas, even and especially those we find disagreeable, I'm wary when I'm ordered to ensure no access can be achieved to certain ideas in my class. So I've made it my goal to read each of the 18 books that were banned this year from my local high school and the state of Utah as a whole. I'm not sure how many I'll review in a video format, but I wanted to track my ideas as I went through these books and hope that I'll refine my opinion on book banning and this whole idea of censorship of ideas as a concept. When should a book be removed from schools? Does this particular book fall under that category? I'm keeping questions like this in mind as I go through these. I've read several of them and I might revisit a few later, but I wanted to start with the last item on the list as it was freshest on my mind. Did Water for Elephants deserve to be banned? Here's my banned book report. Water for Elephants is a historical romance novel by Canadian-American author Sarah Gruen, set primarily in a circus during the Great Depression era. It was adapted into a film in 2011, and the musical version opened in Broadway in 2024. It was banned by the Utah State Board of Education, or USBE, on May 5th, 2025, not 1 month ago from the time of recording this video. The story bounces between Jacob in his youth when he gets wrapped up in a circus working as a veterinarian, and a later Jacob when he is 90 or 93 years old, he can't remember which, and is grappling with fading memory and the frustrations of his stunted, penned existence in a nursing home. The majority of the narrative focuses on his early days. 23-year-old Polish-American Jacob Jankowski is busy prepping for his final exams as a Cornell University veterinary student when he is informed about his parents' deaths in a car accident. In his ensuing breakdown, which is amplified when he learns that his parents had mortgaged their home to pay his tuition, he leaves the school, finds a train, and leaps on board. It turns out this train transports the Benzini brothers' most spectacular show on Earth. An old man named Camel persuades the circus workers not to throw Jacob off the train, and the owner, Uncle Al, hires Jacob as the circus vet. Jacob comes to befriend Camel and a dwarf named Walter. He also meets August, the abusive equestrian director, and August's charming wife, Marlena. Throughout the story, Jacob learns the ins and outs of the circus. He takes particular interest in an elephant named Rosie, who seems belligerent, untrained, and stupid, as she's often called, but Jacob learns that she responds to Polish instruction. Things run smoothly with the elephant from there on out, but not all is well with the vet's human companions. For years, Camel has been drinking Jake, short for Jamaican ginger extract, and not to be confused with the protagonist. It's a drink banned during Prohibition. Because of this lethal habit, Camel loses the ability to move his limbs. Jacob and Walter hide Camel, fearing he will be red-lighted, a circus term meaning thrown off the moving train, the punishment all circus workers fear. In fact, when Uncle Al can't afford to pay the workers, they don't even complain. It's quit and get nothing, keep working and get paid eventually, you hope, or throw a fuss and risk getting thrown off the train in the dead of the night. And then there are the troubles with August, who in his paranoia interprets Jacob and Marlena's dancing and cooperation as evidence that they're having an affair. When August's fits turn violent, Marlena storms off to a hotel. Uncle Al then tries to persuade Jacob to go to her and convince her to go back to August. The The show must go on, and it requires August and Marlena perform without issue. Jacob, of course, refuses, and his feigned attempts at persuading Marlena result in August's paranoid accusations becoming a reality. They make love repeatedly and scheme how to orchestrate their escape from the circus. Jacob tries to assassinate August, going so far as to leap one train car to the next, a knife clutched between his teeth. But when he holds the knife over August, who's snoring sloppily and clutching Marlena's pillow, Jacob finds he can't do it. But he then returns to his car to find no one there. Al, who had learned of his treachery, had Walter and Camel red-lighted in his absence. Jacob assumed he, too, was supposed to have been thrown out, which surely would have resulted in his death on the same rocks where Walter's and Camel's battered bodies were later found. In the climax, surviving red-lighted workers catch up with the train and release the animals during a subsequent show, and the performance turns to pandemonium. The animals stampede, and in the chaos, Jacob sees Marlena being tormented yet again by August. He can't reach Marlena, but the nearby elephant Rosie seems to have a couple schemes of her own. She takes the stake, pinning her to the ground, lifts it with her trunk, and as if recalling August's abuses, cleaves the villain's head in two. Marlena, whose back is turned to the incident, doesn't even seem to notice as Rosie replaces the stake and then steps over her, protecting Marlena from the stampede. Only Jacob witnesses the elephant's acts, and he keeps them to himself. Uncle Al disappears, the Benzini brothers' circus falls to pieces, and Marlena and Jacob begin a new life together, taking with them several of the circus animals, including, of course, Rosie. And Jacob kept Rosie's secret until his old age, when, at 90 years old, or 93, he sneaks out of the nursing home to watch a nearby circus. There he is taken in by the manager, Charlie, the first character who really listens to the old veterinarian. Jacob tells him about his adventures in his youth, and Charlie conceals Jacob from an officer looking for the escaped elder. Jacob is allowed back into the circus, where he at last feels like he is home again. So, why was this book banned? Well, the short version is it has sex in it. But to elaborate on why this particular portrayal of sexual activity is so egregiously offensive to some, but to others possibly defensible, I need to give a little bit of context on the location in which the book has been banned. The Utah State Legislature statutes define sensitive material as, quote, material that constitutes objective sensitive material or subjective sensitive material. Objective or subjective. That's nice. So what are objective and subjective sensitive material? Well, objective sensitive material is material that is pornographic or indecent. Indecent. More subjectivity. Meanwhile, subjective sensitive material is defined as pornographic or indecent material too. That's the same definition. Both reference section 76-5C-208. No clue how I'm supposed to refer to that. Oh boy, isn't this fun. Okay, let's see. Something 208 is about pornographic or indecent material on school property. Alright, we're in the right place, which prohibits distributing any description of illicit sex or sexual immorality, nude or partially denuded figure, or anything pornographic or indecent, which, finally, a definition of indecent includes material that A is harmful to minors, B is pornographic, C is a description of or depiction of illicit sex or sexual immorality, or D contains nude or partially denuded figure. Some redundancies there. You might be seeing a problem here besides the redundancies. The objective definitions of words are the words that they're trying to define, yes, coupled with subjective words. The statute defines pornographic material as pornographic. That's helpful. And indecent material is what is deemed harmful to minors and contains a description of sexual immorality. But who decides what is harmful and what constitutes morality? The Bible contains descriptions of sexual immorality. Should it be banned? I might investigate that question more thoroughly in another video, but I don't want to get too sidetracked right now. The point is, these are subjective terms that will lead to subjective, inconsistent enforcement. We see this in the legislature's further definitions of pornography. Yes, the definitions do go deeper. Stick with me here, there will be a point to all this, I promise. And it's the foundation upon which several of the books are banned and 76-5C-101 defines pornography as, and see if you can find all the room for subjectivity here. A. The average individual applying contemporary community standards finds that, taken as a whole, the material or performance appeals to prurient interest in sex. B. The material or performance is patently offensive in the description or depiction of nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, sadomasochistic abuse, or excretion. And C. Taken as a whole, the material or performance does not have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. I want to clarify here that laws tend to be a bizarre combination of hyper-specific and meticulously detailed while simultaneously extremely vague. The vagueness of this law is not abnormal. I mean, Justice Holmes, one of the most influential Supreme Court justices in U.S. history, who might have actually been a justice during the events of this book, by the way, talks about the law as being, quote, full of morals, rights and duties, malice, intent, and negligence, which aren't to be taken as mathematical formulas. Their significance is to be gathered not simply by taking the words and a dictionary, but by considering their origin and the line of their growth. You can only challenge definitions so much before further dictionary diving becomes a red herring fallacy, distracting from the issue at play. But I want to emphasize the subjectivity of Utah's legal standards of morality and decency because these are the very ideas whose origins and line of growth must be interrogated if we want to know whether book banning is legally and morally defensible. The average individual applying contemporary community standards looks very different today than it did a generation ago, and it looks very different in a small Utah town than it does in the capital, Salt Lake City. Water for Elephants has explicit scenes, but do these constitute patently offensive depictions of sexual conduct, or do they as a whole have literary and artistic value? The Utah State Legislature tries to have it both ways, acknowledging in section 76-5C-207 that sexual depictions may have literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors, while also stating the quite subjective claim that no description or depiction of sexual immorality can have value for minors. Are you sure about that? These laws contain a plethora of sexually explicit descriptions. Should the websites containing the text of these laws be blocked from school websites? Or would a religious Utahn say that Genesis 19, Judah 38, the entirety of Song of Solomon, the brutal rape and murder in Judges of 19, or other numerous dark depictions in the Holy Book have no value? What about a youth whose parents have withheld them from sexual education in class, but who still have questions and want to learn from credible sources? What about a youth who has suffered from sexual assault, or who has friends who have, and who wants answers, or understanding, or just to see they're not alone in the questions that circle in their mind? What's triggering for one person might be relieving for another, a chance to see that someone else, somewhere else, has had the same questions or experiences. Books can be a source of empathy. Who gets to decide whether any content has value for any given reader? Well, the USBE has answered that question. It's R277-628, I don't know. Statutes on sensitive materials largely concord with the state legislatures, but its added provisions establish a process for parents of students within school districts to report and have removed any material they deem to be offensive according to the subject criteria we listed before. Their flowchart illustrates that process, which after review requires the physical removal of the material, and that sensitive materials removed from student access shall be legally disposed of and may not be sold or distributed. So while the USBE is reticent regarding specifics of each book's review process, what likely happened was that some parent reported Water for Elephants, citing one or several of the sexually explicit scenes. The material was reviewed, not in its entirety, just the offensive sections stripped from its context, and as it depicted bare genitalia, or masturbation, or illicit sex, it was deemed objectively offensive. The governing board thus voted for its removal, which was then announced to the USBE, and subsequently to school districts, administrators, and faculty. And here we are. What remains is the question, do the explicit scenes in Water for Elephants have literary value? If section 76-5C-101 excludes from the category of pornography material that, taken as a whole, has serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, what happens when we take the sexual content and put it back in its context, when we look at Water for Elephants as a whole? Put simply, is this art or pornography? John Green described his banned book, Looking for Alaska, as neither pornographic nor titillating to its readers.
So in context, the novel is arguing really in a rather pointed way that emotionally intimate kissing can be a whole lot more fulfilling than emotionally empty oral sex.
I would say Water for Elephants accomplishes a similar artistic and thought-provoking presentation of sexuality in its explicit scenes. That's literary value, I'm suggesting, to be clear. A strategy Gruen employs several times throughout the book is the portrayal of people as animalistic and animals as human-like in their cognition and emotions. For example, toward the end of the book, Marcella leaps from a train car like a gazelle. Jacob is described as having a tongue like a parrot's, and the officer looking for old Jacob has eyes close together like an orangutan's. In addition to these overt animal descriptions are a number of scenes with more subtle animalistic drives and behaviors, and the explicit scenes are among the most savage of these. For example, a circus performer bares her breasts to a crowd at the beginning of the book, Jacob's first live exposure to the nude female form. And while the book describes her work, it really focuses and goes into grotesque detail on the reaction of the men. The men holler, 2 or 3 stand shaking their fist in encouragement, groans rise from the audience. Take it off, baby, take it all off. The men are getting rowdier and more than half are on their feet. When she covers her breasts, it says, quote, a howl of protest rises from the men. Oh, come on, sugar, show us what you got. Oh, come on, I spent 50 cents. When she finally reveals herself, the men whoop and holler, screaming their approval, wave their hats, pump their fists, scream like animals, the book says. All the while, Jacob is being told to watch the men warily as he behaves when feeding the animals shortly afterward, even though the defanged tiger poses no threat with his bite. And this is all it takes to see the animal caged behind society's thin bars. A woman shows her breasts, and the men's bestial instincts are as bare as the woman's form. Then the men leave, back to civilization, composed when in the company of their spouses again. One of the grossest depictions for me was August's breathing when Jacob stood over him with a knife. He growled and slobbered and croaked all the sounds an animal makes, only a shred of humanity left in him. It is so disgusting, it almost makes you want to root for Jacob, to go through with his plan to kill him, to put the rabid creature down. Interestingly, Jacob had put another creature down, a horse that could no longer perform. The innocent passive beast was slain, but the guilty vile human ends up being spared. When Jacob and Marlena do make love, they do so passionately, but not with all the small significant moments that would make these human acts. No, their affair, in which they engage only after being condemned for it, is ravenous, a desperate need to satiate carnal desires, and most of it is confined behind the scenes. So many of the actions these characters take are comparable, instinctive, need-based, without regard to or even actively suppressing the ideals that might cause them to second-guess themselves. Uncle Al asks Jacob to put away his thoughts and reason and to bring Marlena around for the good of the herd. Jacob refuses, not out of reason, but passion. When Jacob and Marlena rescue horses and elephants at the end, they do so instinctively, without thought. When they do slow down and think, they wonder if they erred, if they'll regret it, and they marvel at their own unconscious actions. Even old Jacob is an animal confined to his cage, being fed and cleaned up like the animals had been in the circus. The tiger had been defanged when young Jacob fed him, and now old Jacob is the one being fed, carted around, corralled. He breaks free from the nursing home narratively after the animals are let loose to stampede through the circus, and freed Jacob likewise storms the circus, only to be stopped by a sniveling child. Jacob lashes out, but like the defanged tiger, his bite has no teeth to it. In fact, I'd say the only character to have real autonomy in this book was Rosie, the elephant. Yes, she belongs to the circus, and so do all the other humans. But when Rosie ignores her orders, no one can get her to obey. They can plead and shout and demand all they want, and they do, but she will not be moved. When she does listen, it isn't because she's being ordered, but because someone is actually speaking her language. Even then, you get multiple descriptions of how she listens, how she seems to understand, and for a moment, you're often left wondering, is she going to obey? She does, but it's clearly her choice, and if she ever didn't, her choice would be the final word. August tries to force his way on her, but in the end, she splits his head open like it's nothing. The description of her murder is stunning, full of memory, conniving, fury, and decorum once the deed is done. Quote, she looks at me with bemused eyes, then her gaze shifts to the back of August's bare head. Oh, Jesus, I say, suddenly understanding, don't do it, don't do it. She lifts lifts the stake as though it weighs nothing and splits his head in a single clean movement. She continues to hold the stake until he topples forward, and then she slides it almost lazily back into the earth. She does what Jacob could not, kills August, and then protects Marlena. While the stampede of humans topple and tramp on each other, the elephant is protective, and the animals flock together, running side by side until they all burst out. People and animals flee together in a great squealing mass. It's hard to say who's more terrified, people and animals all running as far and as fast as they can. There's a joint theme here of autonomy. Jacob repeatedly expresses a need to protect. It's how he feels needed, that base masculine drive to be the defender. But he's largely helpless, constantly needing to be told what's going on from the first day on the train to the end, when more seasoned workers sound the alarm of the stampede and he doesn't even know how to interpret the alarm. He constantly feels the need to save, and he constantly ends up needing to be saved. Even when Rosie solves the problem he couldn't bring himself to solve, Jacob frames it as a noble thing he did. He keeps Rosie's secret so she won't be put down, and so Marlena doesn't have to know what the elephant did. He tries to tell rivals who are trying to take Rosie away after the Benzini brothers break up that she's a dumb animal, ostensibly to save Rosie, but they don't believe him. It's Rosie's playing dumb that convinces them, not Jacob's insistence. Jacob even acknowledges at the end of his life that the secret he kept, both for Rosie's and Marlena's sake, didn't really matter after a while. It was the gesture that mattered. And in the end, it's the elephant that remembers everything from the abuse to the aid that she received. Jacob, from beginning to end, can't even remember how old he is. Throughout the book, the animals have autonomy, agency, and power. The human keepers are slaves to their passion, fear, and instincts. The sex in the story, though explicit, is no exception. It's part of the theme, showing one more way that humans let themselves be governed by passions. It's not there for the reader to revel in their lust. It challenges that very lust with a glaring, hot, uncomfortable spotlight. Do this book's explicit scenes have literary value? I would say yes, they do, serving as a magnifying glass to closely examine and interrogate human nature, both our shortcomings and how we desperately try to wrestle control to compensate for them. A final question I like to consider with these banned books is this: why might this book be useful to read? Not just for a general audience, but for Utah students in particular. One possible answer lies in a recent event related to Utah's standards on sensitive instruction, but also an event upon which Water for Elephants could comment. Utah Senator Mike Lee has proposed a bill called the Interstate Obscenity Definition Act to clarify the legal definition of obscenity for all states, which the Salt Lake Tribune has said could, quote, set the stage for a nationwide ban on pornography. Keeping in mind the aforementioned ambiguity in definitions and my interrogation into the nature of the book's explicit scenes, you might already see why I regard this proposition with a skeptical eye. Senator Lee defended his bill by saying, quote, obscenity isn't protected by the First Amendment, but hazy and unenforceable legal definitions have allowed extreme pornography to saturate American society and reach countless children. Our bill updates the legal definition of obscenity for the internet age so this content can be taken down and peddlers prosecuted. I hope he really does have a clear, unambiguous definition. If prosecution is on the table and sharing a book like Looking for Alaska or Water for Elephants could land someone in jail, then there better be much clearer criteria than, for example, Justice Stewart's infamous definition of obscenity as, quote, I know it when I see it. I don't think Water for Elephants, taken as a whole, should be labeled obscene. The state board disagrees. I wouldn't want my guilt or innocence to come down to the opinion of one judge. The current Supreme Court ruling, which evaluates whether material is obscene and thus not protected under the First Amendment, comes from the 1973 Miller versus California case, which asked whether the sale and distribution of obscene materials by mail was protected speech. The 5-4 ruling that obscene material did not enjoy First Amendment protection lays out a 3-pronged test to determine whether materials count as obscene, a test which should look familiar to you now. 1. Would the average person applying contemporary community standards courts find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest. 2. Does the work depict or describe in a patently offensive way sexual conduct as defined by applicable state law? 3. Does the work, when taken as a whole, lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? If the answer to all three is yes, the material is obscene and thus not protected speech. So, this is the grounds for the Utah State Legislature statutes, the USPE's policies, and the school's removal of books which some parent has reported as offensive. Mike Lee criticized the current definition of obscenity as difficult to assess and prosecute, and that its standards are subjective and vague. Subjective and vague. Boy, he'd really hate lots of other laws, like, I don't know, the Constitution, probably the Bible. They're full of things that are subjective and vague. Perhaps, though, it's difficult to assess and prosecute obscenity because obscenity as a concept is inherently subjective and vague. I know it when I see it sounds nice, as long as you agree with the person doing the interpreting. So Lee isn't just protesting the obscene, he's protesting ambiguity. He thinks that moral relativism is the threat. One man's porn is another man's art, I guess. He wants to replace personal morality with a national standard, as long as that national standard matches his personal definition of morality. And that's what his bill does. He is attempting to alter the second prong of the Miller test, eliminating the state law clause and replacing it with a national definition. Content would now be deemed obscene if it, quote, depicts, describes, or represents an actual or simulated sexual act or sexual conduct, actual or simulated normal or perverted sexual acts, or lewd exhibition of the genitals, with the objective intent to arouse, titillate, or gratify the sexual desires of a person. This is Lee's personal definition of obscenity, which as a national standard, quote, removes the dependence on ever-changing and elusive public opinion, replacing ambiguity with practical standards to make obscenity identifiable. I have two questions. 1, would it though? And 2, should it though? First question, would this new definition make obscenity crystal clear? Keep in mind that the first and third prongs remain. The debates on what an average person believes and what contemporary community standards are continues. We still have to interrogate each work's literary, artistic, political, and scientific value when taken as a whole. Narrowing the definition of obscenity doesn't narrow the definitions of all the other ambiguous criteria which also must be considered. The new definition even adds more ambiguous criteria. How do you objectively assess whether the material's intent is to arouse, titillate, or gratify the sexual desires of a person? This problem is twofold. First, you can't always know or prove the intent of the work's creator. John Green has made quite clear his intent in the explicit scene in Looking for Alaska, but the reviewer and their perception of an imagined reader's reaction was the final judge. Death of the author, right? Second, what arouses, titillates, or gratifies a person's sexual desire is not a constant thing. Do I need to spell this out for you, Mike? I guess if I do, well, then I will, and I hope this helps. Your sexual interests are not universal. Some people find breasts arousing, some do not. If a woman wears a revealing shirt, does she become walking obscene material? Does she become, illegal if she crosses state lines or goes outside? What if she didn't mean to be arousing? Or, brace yourself for this idea, what if she did? Do we hold her responsible for other people's thoughts? Now, let's say we get one of those people out there who is not Mike, and this person finds something else, elbows, attractive. So there's a woman that wears a shirt that completely covers her chest, but she has short sleeves. Is she now obscene material? What about people who are into shoulders or backs or feet or faces? If you want to protect the world from the obscene, you should probably encourage all women to veil their entire self, not just their faces or their chests, whatever anyone anywhere might find at all attractive. But then what if someone finds the feminine form concealed alluringly behind cloth suggestive, arousing, titillating even? In that case, maybe we should just pass another law, flat out prohibiting women leave their home. That should solve the problem of obscene thoughts, right?
The very men and women who should be standing up to radical fundamentalism are so frightened of losing primary battles to religious zealots that they've thrown in the towel on sanity. So we get this.
Yes, that the Constitution established the United States of America as a Christian nation.
But we should call them what they are, the American Taliban.
Now, this might come off to you as a slippery slope, but this notion that we can or should control the stimulus of the thought and that the one titillated by the stimulus is the victim, is at the heart of both the Taliban's oppression of women and Mike Leigh's longing to prosecute any producer or distributor of what he personally considers obscene. Now, perhaps you think I'm unfairly putting words in Mike Leigh's mouth, but I want to emphasize that this rhetoric of controlling women to protect men from obscenity is not me being hyperbolic, but actually a pervasive notion in Utah culture. For example, here's Dallin H. Oaks, a former lawyer and currently the second most senior apostle in the LDS church to which Leigh belongs, along with roughly 60% of Utahns.
And young women, please understand that if you dress immodestly, you are magnifying this problem by becoming pornography to some of the men who see you.
This said, Utahns are not a monolith. Dan McClellan, an LDS scholar who tries to combat misinformation and those who weaponize religion to oppress the less privileged, has this to say on the topic.
So the only parts of the Bible that actually directly address men lusting after women places the blame entirely and exclusively on the part of the luster.
Further, the political activist group Elevate Utah is not a fan of Leigh's proposal.
Mike Leigh, our senator, once a constitutional conservative, is leading the charge to replace personal liberty with federally mandated sexual morality. And if you think they're stopping at porn, you would be wrong.
This brings me to my second question. Should we remove dependence on ever-changing public opinion? Clearly, public opinion is not a settled matter. It isn't today, and broad trends that do exist today do not reflect the public opinion of past generations. When is the public opinion correct and needing to be solidified? If we were ruled today by the stagnant political opinion of the past, we might still have institutionalized slavery or bans on interracial marriage. Not long ago, interracial marriage was seen as immoral. What from modern morality will seem obscene to future generations? Which time period, Mike, has the correct public opinion? Because civil rights came from decades, if not centuries, of people actively trying to change the public opinion. Is this constant flux a sign of moral decay? Or of progress? Or fluctuation in any given direction on any given topic? I don't doubt the sincerity of Mike Leigh's intent with this bill to protect minors from exposure to indecency, however one defines it, but I do doubt the efficacy of his approach and, yes, the morality of his approach. According to LDS doctrine, it was Satan's plan, not God's, to structure a world that compels morality. It was fluctuating public opinion that led the LDS Church to abandon its prohibitions on black members from receiving the priesthood or temple ordinances. This is the danger of legislating morality. It comes down to the question, whose morality? And as much as you might hate it, morality and obscenity are fluid concepts. History has not judged kindly those who have tried to freeze it in place. We constantly, inevitably, grow past stagnant paradigms. In that sense, I would actually say water for elephants, which would be banned under Senator Mike Leigh's obscene law, comments quite strikingly on the very bill that would seek to silence it. Leigh presents himself as the hero in his defense of this bill, but that rings hollow to me. His think of the children excuses are weak justifications for his grasp for power. He's desperate for control, not, I think, because he's power hungry, but because he trusts himself with control more than anyone else. He thinks himself the Jacob of this story, the protagonist, the protector, the one trying to do the right thing. And maybe he's right, since Jacob was deluded. His heart was, for the most part, in the right place, but his desperate grasping for control led him nowhere as he spiraled in the circus. What was it Rousseau said? Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One man thinks himself the master of others, but remains more of a slave than they are. But I would actually submit Mike Leigh is more like August than Jacob, and my reasoning comes back to that question. Who decides what material arouses sexual desires? This book has sex, but none of it is sexy, not to me. Could I see this book as being too intense for minors? Sure, and I would have no qualms with a parent prohibiting their child from reading it. But should that parent's judgment be imposed upon the entirety of youths who grapple with intense, instinctive, animalistic drives every day? Those who see the way people dress, and yes, who are exposed to pornography, but who might also just see a pretty face or the natural contours of someone's body and be just as insatiably aroused. What's better, to teach society to remove the offense, or the youth to tame their wild thoughts and impulses? I tend to advocate for the latter, but Mike Leigh seeks to label the offended as the victim and the offender as guilty. August was so certain that the affair, which didn't exist at the time, was happening. He saw every little glance and gesture as evidence that he was right. He saw it, he felt certain of it, and he lashed out. He was desperate, hungry for control, to right the wrongs he knew were present and pervasive. And it was obvious to the accused that in his mad ravings, he was simply paranoid, falling apart. He could not trust others, which may be interconnected to his inability to fathom that, just maybe, he was wrong. The efforts to ban books are a branch of efforts to control expression, wielded by those who praise the First Amendment when they approve, but who don't trust we the people to apply it correctly. And they cling to every banned book as evidence validating their paranoia, empowering their puritanical impulses that they feel they must impose on everyone. Cage everything, remove the teeth, suppress your reason, whip everything and everyone into submission, force the world to comply, keep everything staked down and still. Surely it will stay this way forever, and that's how you survive in the circus. So, what's my final assessment? I would not ban Water for Elephants statewide. Its graphic depictions of human sexuality are likely too intense for some readers, but not all. I would rather a system be put in place for parents to approve or reject certain books or criteria when their child tries to check out said books. I could see some parents marking this one or even whole topics as subjects they do not want their child reading. That is fine. I do not believe a school or statewide ban is necessary, though. Does this book have educational value? I could see it being used by teachers. I wouldn't have students read the whole thing. It isn't quite relevant enough to the Great Depression or any topics in that era to be justified for a history class. But for a class debating ethics with regard to the treatment of animals or workers, or an English class wherein a teacher wants a philosophical discussion on the difference between humans and animals, what really separates us, or makes something civilized, I could see selections being quite useful. The book is not a challenging read, but it isn't a mindless one, the sort older students wanting to challenge themselves might feel inclined to check out for a personal read. Again, some warning label about its content or requirement for parental approval would be reasonable, but I oppose the USBE's choice to ban its availability in schools. I do not think that was necessary.